Hi, and welcome to the presentation and discussion of the 44th Statement of the Latin America Committee on Macroeconomic and Financial Issues, CLAAF for its acronym in Spanish. I'm Liliana Rojas Suarez. I'm the Director of the Latin American Initiative at the Center for Global Development and the Chair of the committee. I am accompanied today by the committee members and authors of the statement. In alphabetical order, and you can see them, they are Laura Alfaro, the Warren Albert Professor at Harvard Business School, who was also a former Minister of National Planning and Economic Policy in Costa Rica. Guillermo Calvo, a professor, well-known professor, of course, at Columbia University and former Chief Economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. Augusto de la Torre, former chief economist for Latin America, the Caribbean at the World Bank, and also a former governor from the Central Bank of Ecuador. Jose de Gregorio, I almost gave Augusto your title, Jose, because he was a former governor of the Central Bank and also a former Minister of the Economy, Ministry, and Energy in Chile, and currently is a professor of economics at the University of Chile. Roque Fernandez, economics professor at UCEMA University, also former Minister of Finance from Argentina. Pablo Guidotti, currently professor of the government school at the University of Torquato di Tella, and former Vice Minister of Economy in Argentina. Paulo Leme, the executive in residence professor of finance at the Miami Business School, University of Miami, and a long-time and former managing director at Goldman Sachs. Enrique Mendoza, the presidential professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania. And Andres Velasco, who will shortly join us, the dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics, and a former Minister of Finance of Chile. Another member that participated in the production of the statement but has not been able to join us is Ernesto Talvi, former Minister of Foreign Affairs from Uruguay. And as I was saying, he unfortunately couldn't join us today. So for all of you that are joining us today, please, if you want to send questions during our discussion and presentation, please send them through the YouTube chat. They will be shared with us. The way we're going to proceed today is I'm going to make a presentation of our statement, and then we'll open the discussion for questions with the members of the committee. So let me share my screen with you to make the initial presentation and remarks of the statement. So we titled this time our statement, Fiscal Policy at the Time of Polarization, Addressing Latin America Tough Dilemmas. This looks like a very ambitious title. We will not be able to cover everything that the title implies, but we'll try to give you some perspective on how we see the region and its dilemmas on the fiscal front especially. For starters, let's see where is Latin America now. And to just give you a broad idea of how is Latin America doing, we're showing here a Bloomberg resilient indicator that we're chosen to choose you because it includes a number of indicators in both the health, economic, and social aspects. And the countries in red are the Latin American countries. These are the scores. And as you can see, Latin American countries perform the worst in the world, with the exception of Chile. So why is this happening? Well, it reflects many aspects, of course, but vaccination delays, a new and more powerful wave of infections, and the initial conditions that actually were there when the pandemic started, like weak social and institutional conditions actually have played a significant role in the management of the limited stock of available vaccines. Now, the good news for the region is that the global economy is actually supportive of Latin American recovery. This is a graph of the commodity prices. And as you can see, most of the commodity prices actually are reaching levels comparable to those that occurred during the commodity boom period, the period that went from 2003 to 2013. So the challenge for the region really is how to turn the mechanical cyclical rebound that is going to happen just because it went down so deeply, and so of course there is going to be a mechanical rebound, but that mechanical rebound should be transformed into a sustained job creating recovery. Now, for dealing with this challenge, we have to take into account that the risk of policy mistake has increased significantly. So the committee saw that this is really a time to raise awareness and avoid those mistakes that could be proved very costly in the long run. There are two kind of broad areas where those mistakes can occur, right? The first one is that there are pressures, understandable pressures, given the suffering and losses of lives, for more public expending and social and political resistance to reforms, right? Especially fiscal reforms. And so for the region, the issue is how to spend well the scarce fiscal resources and avoid short-sighted, politically motivated responses. And also another challenge is that the more current favorably external conditions that I just show you can induce policymakers to actually underestimate the long-term risk of high budget deficits and debt. So a critical dilemma that the committee has identified is how do you manage the response, needed response to the pandemic in the short run with the needed mass fiscal consolidation to make the fiscal stand sustainable. So let me first show you quite a telling graph. On the horizontal axis, we have the original or the initial, I would say better, the initial ratio of debt, external debt to GDP in the number of countries in the region. And on the vertical axis, we have the fiscal response. And the relationship that we observe is that countries that had lower external debt as an initial condition were able to do a much more strong fiscal response than those that actually had a larger stock of debt at the beginning of the pandemic. In spite of those that have done more response than others, and one has to underline that the capacity to the fiscal space between countries in the region differed significantly, still the fiscal stimulus on average has been only 4% of GDP, and that is much, much smaller than in advanced economies. But even with that lower average, the region still faces significant challenges and risk in its financial outlook. And one of the most important problems is that for many years, the region have been having a sustained growth and underperformance. If that were to continue, the uncertainty about the country's capacity to repay existing and new debt increases significantly. So in that light, the committee recommends that yes, because of the pandemic, there is a need to expend government resources, but they certainly should be well used and transitory. one of the problems that the region have had in the past is that some of expenses that were supposed to be transitory actually became permanent. And this is a pandemic, is transitory, so the expansion in fiscal balances should be transitory. Now, I said before that not all countries have sufficient fiscal space. Well, what happens or what should be the case for those countries with weaker fiscal position and those that actually have limited access to international capital markets, so cannot use external private funding to fund their expansions in the expenses? Well, the committee believed that the multilaterals should fill up this financing gap, and we will, during the discussion, talk more about this. And of course, this expansion, as I said, needs to be transitory, which means that that response should also be accompanied by active measures to strengthen the structural, the long-term fiscal positions. The committee identified a number of what we call the do's and don'ts of public policy responses during the pandemic. So when you talk about taxes, to what extent should taxes be used? The committee believed that we should use tax policies with a lot of caution. First, some countries, of course, there is a lot of space to increase tax base and reduce tax evasion. We recognize that. But at the same time, we stress that this is a medium or long-term goal, that trying to implement that kind of reforms to increase the tax base and reduce tax evasion could actually face large social oppositions if implemented during the pandemic. And the example of Colombia with all the social unrest that happened, the attempt to implement a tax reform, witness this problem. And the second issue with taxes is that it's very important to avoid the imposition of distortionary taxes that may yield very small fiscal revenues when you are imposing those taxes, but would be detrimental to incentives for the private investors at the time when private investment is so much needed in the region. In terms of something that definitely should be done in public policy is addressing major social anxieties. And here we definitely recognize over and over again that is very important dealing with the increased insecurity that the population is right now feeling with respect to access to job, their ability to sustain income levels that they had in the past, and to access public services. So, reinforcing what I just said, the committee strongly believed that it would be counterproductive to ignore the new political trends in the region that results from weakened political institutions and polarization, as well as the challenges faced, especially by the lower and middle income sectors of the society. The question then is how to address those social anxieties. And we believe that there are two tools available to the disposal of among many, but we stress these two: social assistance and social insurance. And we make a differentiation between them as well as to whom they should be directed. Social assistance schemes, which we recognize have improved substantially in the region, are needed for the very poor. And actually, they have been used during the pandemic, and most of the COVID-related measures, actually 70%, have been channeled through these social assistance schemes. So these schemes are basically for the very poor. But social insurance systems dealing with insecurities that I just mentioned to you, and those social insurance systems include pension benefit and unemployment benefit, unemployment insurance, need major reforms to provide protection to citizens that are not poor, the above the poverty line and the middle class. Uruguay system for social insurance is a good example of that. So again, to stress the point, the public policy should be increasingly directed at reducing insecurity and risk faced by the middle class, while of course maintaining an improvement and improving the transfers targeted to the poor. Now, we also discussed during our conversations and deliberations for the preparation of the report, a statement, what should be the role of the IMF? And in that regard, we have a number of views about what the role of the IMF is. As we all know, and is widely recognized, the COVID-19 crisis is a large and exogenous shock that basically affected all countries the same. Likewise, then, we believe that access criteria for IMF support should be uniform across recipient countries, and that conditionality in IMF facilities should basically focus on making sure that the foreign assistance that is being provided goes to targeted sector rather than feeding capital flight. We'll expand more on these issues again in the discussion that we're having with the members. Now, something that worries us quite a bit in the committee is that sometimes in its effort to support the policies that are being taken in the emerging markets and Latin America in particular, the IMF basically push across for the same kind of policies, fiscal expansions that actually have and can work in developed countries, in advanced economies, but not always in emerging markets, simply because of the issues that I just mentioned before, not sufficient fiscal space, high ratios of debt to GDP, or high concentration in the short debt relative to international reserves. So emerging markets are subject to the volatility of the international capital markets, and they cannot afford to expand in the same way, fiscal expansions in the same way that emerging that advanced economies. So emerging markets cannot do the same type of fiscal response than advanced economies. So again, our concern is that if the IMF just make open calls for fiscal expansions that go beyond what is indispensable and temporary response to the pandemic, that could actually lead to debt problems in a number of emerging markets, including Latin America. And what is really bad would be really bad for the region is a future wave of debt restructuring. Finally, we couldn't end our statement without raising awareness about the risk in of a sudden change in the U.S. Macroeconomic stance. U.S., as you know, there has been such a discussion about what's happening with inflation in the United States, right? Now, at this point, the U.S. inflation expectations are contained, but they might increase and lead to the Fed to adopt a very and overly tight policy stance, which could translate, of course, in increases in interest rates, in the Fed interest rates. This could provoke a sharp reversal of capital inflows to the region, and the policymakers in the region needs to be extremely aware and vigilant as regard to what their financing needs are, which are reflected in their current account deficits, which we believe are going to start increasing as their economies recover. And to deal with this risk, the region and policymaker should make all attempts possible to build sufficient, especially liquidity buffers, to deal with this event of potential sudden stop so that they minimize the effects of country risk premium. So this is in a nutshell what we have in the report, of course, really condensed. You can find our statement in claaf.org/statement or at cedep.org/Latin America. I'd like to stop sharing the screen now and actually start with the second part of the program, which is our conversation with the members. So let me first start with broader questions, and then I'll move to country-specific issues. Perhaps I can start with Andres, hi Andres, I already introduced you at the very beginning, so happy to have you here. So Andres, our statement gives enormous importance to the issue of debt sustainability. What are the limits for public debt in Latin America? And how can you determine those limits?
Thank you, Liliana. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here. Delighted to be sharing this call with friends and colleagues. That is a key question, Liliana, with difficult answers both for developed and for emerging economies. It is clear that a situation in which interest rates are very, very low makes the debt carrying capacity of countries larger. And as has been widely discussed, when the rate of interest is smaller than the rate of economic growth, it is possible to spend more today without necessarily raising taxes tomorrow. But this does not mean that there are no limits to borrowing. There are plenty of limits to borrowing still for at least two reasons. One is that interest rates and growth rates are endogenous. That is to say, they don't sit there as you borrow more and more and more. And in the limit, clearly interest rates will rise if governments want to suck all the savings out of an economy. And secondly, because having interest rates that are lower than the growth rate are another indication of what economists call a bubble, a situation in which there's more than one equilibrium, and you can have a nice outcome in which interest rates are low and people want to hold the debt, but you can also have a not so nice outcome in which there's a sudden panic, investors dump the debt and interest rates rise. And therefore, we must be cognizant of the fact that even for rich countries, there may be another equilibrium. And we economists also have to admit that we don't have very good theories of how it is that we jump from the good outcome to the bad outcome. We have some sense that these good outcomes are less likely for advanced economies. I don't think anybody is expecting a big run on treasury debt on the US, but who knows? But clearly, as the economy becomes smaller, as its currency becomes less liquid, as its market for securities becomes less deep, there's more and more potential for a run. And as you mentioned, there are a number of other differences between advanced economies and emerging economies. One is the ability to tax. Some countries in Latin America, Brazil and Argentina, have fairly high rates of taxation to GDP, but many others in Central America or even Mexico have fairly low rates or low ratios, I should say, of tax revenue to GDP. Institutional quality also matters. One has the sense that advanced economies in a pinch can tax more, borrow more, attach assets, do things that will make the debt safe. The same is not the case in emerging economies. That is why, and I will end here, the report by the committee is cautiously optimistic. This has been, not just any time, there's been a crisis, and crises are a time that requires action, that requires boldness, and a number of countries in the region have been bold. But the report is also cautious in the sense that as the crisis begins to recede, we have to think more of the limits. We have to think more of how to engage in fiscal consolidation. Maybe not this year, but maybe beginning next year. And we also have to think hard about the differences across countries. Some countries in Latin America, Peru, Chile, others still have a fair bit of fiscal space. A number of other countries in the region, Brazil among them, don't have a lot of fiscal space left. And that means that the time of reckoning may come sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Andres. Along the same vein, Guillermo, policymakers in Latin America and emerging markets in general are always concerned about events in the global economy that could result in decreases in investors' risk appetite for their bonds. Are sudden stops in the horizon for emerging markets? How could the countries get ready for such an event?
Well, the easy answer is that yes, of course. That's what the emerging market means. You are exposed to things that, as Andres has explained, are not so relevant for advanced economies. The question is, how serious is the situation now? That's very hard to assess. And in our discussion, I think it came out that there are so many factors that I wouldn't be able to put a probability on that. I think it would not be reasonable. But I think the attitude in emerging markets, and that's one bottom line of what I want to say, the attitude must be to be always prepared for sudden stops. Because there are two kinds of fiscal policies. There's a fiscal policy that advanced economies can have the luxury of undertaking. And we do. Sometimes we have space. And it's not only space, it's more than that. We depend on what the rest of the world thinks about the emerging market crash. So that's good to have in mind. And we say a lot about that in our statement. But we have to be prepared for a sudden stop because the cost of sudden stops is enormous if you don't run it well. So I think I would put my advice for emerging market, for Latin America in particular, is to keep an eye on that possibility and be prepared. And here's where my basic bottom line lies. Be prepared. How do you get prepared for that? Can we change anything now? Can we have more international reserves than we have? It's very difficult. Can the IMF come to help us? Yes, they have very good intentions, but they don't have a lot of money. And besides, it's a very complicated institution. You cannot just give them a telephone call and they will come to help you, because that's not the way things work. So what is important is something that I call fire drills, like fire drills. And I've seen, and we have seen, the case where the fire drills didn't work. Argentina 2002, asymmetric dollarization specification, for example. So be prepared for that, because the central bank independence is good. But when you have a crisis like that, you have to talk to the finance minister, and you have to talk to the other minister, and everybody is all of a sudden involved in the same problem. How do you talk? To whom do you talk? Who does what? Sorry, I don't want to expand on this, but I think it's very important. That's something that we can do. The other thing, and with this I would end, is think about market-friendly policies. And they are difficult, but they can be implemented. Like, for example, you can give incentives for investment. You can lower taxes on marginal investment, not the whole bunch, but for new investment. So do something like that, and also transmit the view that profit making, yes, it could be a sin, and you can go to hell if you only think about profit making. But the good thing about people who want to make money is that if you control them, they can do things that are unthinkable, like finding a new vaccine overnight. I mean, those guys who are involved there, they were thinking about money at the end of the road. So nothing wrong with that. Let me end with it.
Thank you, Guillermo. A very passionate intervention, and I certainly like that. You mentioned the IMF. Pablo, let me turn to you and kind of build up on Guillermo's. And he said you cannot just get the telephone call and call the IMF and they will help. So what do you think would be an effective response of the IMF to support Latin Americans' effort to deal with the pandemic?
Thank you, Liliana. First of all, the fact is that the IMF continues to be the main institution that channels economic support and advice from the official international community to countries in Latin America. And certainly the task for the IMF is difficult because, as we mentioned in the statement, our region is quite heterogeneous. And as Andres mentioned, some countries, for instance, have some fiscal space, others have high debt, as Brazil, Argentina, and even Uruguay. So it's difficult for the IMF to have a single message. And I think that is what we, in a certain sense, reflected in our discussions, that today maybe the IMF is pushing for policies that are more suited for the advanced economies and is not taking enough effort in differentiating the situation of the different countries in Latin America. And in my view, also is not putting enough emphasis on the reforms that eventually translate into growth, which in the end, for the high debt countries, the only way out is going to be through growth. Of course, in the region, the IMF has a big problem, which is Argentina, which is the largest program under negotiation. And unfortunately, nothing is happening. There is like a dance between the government and the IMF in which everybody is diplomatic, but there is no real advance. Okay, and I want to connect this to one of the major decisions that is being taken at the fund, which is the new allocation of SDRs. Okay, I'm very much supportive of what Janet Yellen initially in her letter to the G20 indicated, that the US Treasury would support the new allocation, but that the new resources would need to be directed really to responding to the pandemic and to help low-income countries to sort of reconstruct and rebuild their economies. Namely, she was pointing out at some, even though on a legal basis, we know that the SDR allocation is unconditional and every member receives its shares, I think that it is important to focus why we do this measure and how we can direct the new resources to really respond to a specific problem. Today, we do not have a global financial crisis. So do we need additional liquidity. I would say that what we say in the statement is a little bit along the lines of what Guillermo was mentioning. Maybe we should use the resources to strengthen our capacity to deal with turbulence that can arise in the future from the global outlook. But say, let me connect the new SDR allocation with what is happening in Argentina. In Argentina, the government has said that they will use the additional 4.4 billion that they would receive of FDRs to essentially pay the installments that are coming due from the outstanding program during this year, as a means essentially of postponing negotiations and postponing reforms. So this is a clear example why how an unconditional allocation of resources is counterproductive. Instead of producing and pushing for reforms, is actually facilitating the delay. And the last thing we need in the world in the midst of a pandemic is really not taking decisions, okay, and letting the time go by. So I think that as we say in the statement, the IMF has to continue to raise its voice for fiscal responsibility, has to take into account that some countries cannot translate this concept into higher taxes because tax pressure is already very high, and that eventually the region needs to go back and look at the recent history. The region has not been growing fast, so it needs to push for reforms that actually attract investment and transform the current situation into long-term growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. You already started the country discussion by mentioning Argentina, and there are so many issues that we can talk about Argentina, and perhaps that's where we should move next. So let me take advantage of the wealth of country-specific knowledge that we have among the members of the committee. Here we have representation from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru. So to deal with some of the issues that each particular country is facing, let me continue with Argentina and ask Roque a question on social insurance. Social insurance is funded in Argentina with 40% contributions from worker salaries. Given the poor coverage of the risk of aging, unemployment, and health shocks, there of course is the perception that contributions are largely a tax on labor. Right now, these days, the press is reporting that the government is planning to nationalize the provision of services of health insurance provided by private companies. Do you agree with that statement? You're muted, Roque.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you, Liliana. Yes, no, I do not agree with that in the sense that when we wrote the paragraph about social insurance, given that we have several countries represented in CLAAF, we paid special attention to mention that Uruguay was a good example to follow in terms of social insurance. The case of Argentina is probably the largest case of polarization in terms of number of years that we have been exposed to populism. And the point of social insurance is that populism usually take advantage of those resources that are delivered to provide health services, and they are spent somewhere else. The same with respect to unemployment compensations or retirement plans. So the idea of working in terms of social insurance, in the case of Argentina, if we try to improve that, it's probably have to be done on the basis of reforms of the system, not in increasing the social security contribution, because social security contributions are very, very high, and the money is not going to provide the health insurance or unemployment insurance or all those items. So I think that we were very, very country specific in our recommendation mentioning Uruguay, and I fully agree with that.
Thank you, Roque. Let me turn to other two large countries in the region, Brazil and Mexico. First on Brazil. Paulo, how effective have Brazilian government macroeconomic policy response to the COVID-19 crisis been? And what do you think will be the consequences in terms of public dynamics and inflation?
Thank you, Liliana, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with all of my colleagues. I would say there are two levels to answer your question. The more technical one on your question, I think that for the most part, I think it was quite successful. The central bank was very aggressive, very bold, actually sometimes even anticipating some of the moves by central banks in advanced economies. And their liquidity and credit assistance were in magnitudes of 15 to 20% of GDP, just absolutely gigantic, cutting interest rates to negative real rates. And it was quite effective in avoiding problems in the financial system and also delinquency and bankruptcy, both by corporates and individuals. On the fiscal side, the effort was also perhaps too large relative to its debt and its budget. It amounted to just short of 10% of GDP, between 9 to 10% of GDP, perhaps not as effectively used, but I would say the combination of both, plus a very favorable commodity price shock, essentially avoided a deeper trough in terms of a recession, which was limited to 4.5% last year. And to the surprise, including to myself, Brazil is growing at about 5%. So the recovery has been very, very quick. Obviously, you have the statistical base effect. And then answer your question about, okay, now you have to pay for the bill, which is, okay, what happened to the debt? Surprisingly, the combination of two things, growth and the increase in tax collection, and remember our good old Tanzi effect, that an inflation surprise, because that has been a huge food price shock. Headline inflation is about 8%, core is below 3% at the target. But I would say growth and the inflation shock, and inflation is highly positive on the primary. So after raising the primary to almost 10% of GDP in terms of a deficit, it basically is plunging towards 2.5% of GDP deficit. And that dynamic that seemed to be ready to explode toward 100% of GDP, as a matter of fact, stabilized, and now it has an inflection point lowering towards 88 and 86% of GDP. So I would say for the most part, could have been better, but it worked. But that's not the point. The point is that the cheaper part, and in a country with the resources, wealth, and a pharmaceutical industry like Brazil, and with a very broad public health system, it failed immensely in letting down the population on health policies. I think the amount of fatalities was unnecessarily large. The denial that this is a problem at very high levels of government was very costly, both in terms of transmitting the disease more broadly, but also I think we really fell behind the vaccination process. Because of the lack of leadership at the executive level, it became regional and completely arbitrary. Just to give you an idea, we have about 10 different vaccines, but you can't find them. and as a result of that, I mean, you just look in terms of the numbers of vaccinations per day compared to the peak of 4 million in the US, you have just short of 1 million, perhaps 750,000 a day. And as a result of that, the percentage of the population fully immunized is no more than 12%, which I find to be more than just simply very disappointing. I find it to be, from a human perspective, unacceptable. And also the whole process in terms of having the elderly baking in the sun at 102 Fahrenheit and getting there after 8 hours waiting, not having the vaccine, I think that has been a collapse and a failure in terms of public policy. And that was the cheap one versus the 9% of GDP on the fiscal expenditure side. So yes, on the technical macro, I think it came out well, but I think one has to question very deeply, I mean, what happened on public health, because the damage was very large.
Thank you so much, Paulo. We certainly could spend the whole session talking about each country individually. We don't have the time, but we want to give the audience a flavor of the feeling that our members have on the different countries. So because of that, we need to keep changing from country to country. So let's move on to Mexico. Enrique, according to IMF data and the graph we actually shown in the presentation, Mexico has only spent 0.7 of its GDP in fiscal measures to respond to the pandemic, far less than all other G20 emerging market economies and actually most countries in Latin America. In addition, Mexico also ranked second in the world in the COVID case fatality ratio and 6th in death per 100,000 population. What are your views about why this is happening? Why has the Mexican government performed in such a way to handling the COVID crisis to give these very poor results?
Thank you, Liliana. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this interesting meeting. And thank you everyone in the committee for all the exchanges we had during the preparation of this document. They were very enriching, and I certainly learned a lot. To the point of your question, to be precise, so I'm going to specifically answer your question about Mexico. I think many of the things that apply to Mexico apply to a lesser degree to the rest of the region. I think we should all acknowledge and be very sad about the cost of the human tragedy that COVID has been everywhere. But certainly in Latin America, it has been particularly bad because of all the weaknesses that are highlighted by even some of the figures that you show. By the quality of the healthcare system, by the inability to use fiscal space, by the institutional weaknesses. So all of that resulted in what you noted, that part of it certainly was the weak fiscal response in Mexico, but the initial conditions were already going to predetermine that Latin America as a whole was going to have a really bad time with COVID. And the mortality numbers that you quoted, you go across the region, you'll see that many of the large countries of the region are in the top 10 list of infected fatalities and in the top 10 list of fatalities per 100,000 population. So yes, it was a global shock, but the mortality of it in our region has been particularly severe. And it's something that we all should be very, very sad about. It's a really, really costly human tragedy. And certainly in Mexico, it's all the dimensions of what was happening in Mexico in December and January of this year. Is, in all practical purposes, very similar to what happened in India. It went much less reported, but qualitatively speaking was very, very similar to the tragedy in India. So why did the government decide to respond with 0.7% of GDP? I mean, you can look at the other countries in the figure that you show, and across the board in the data of the IMF, and you see that it's orders of magnitude smaller than what most other countries did. Some of it has to do with an obsession on a particular set of infrastructural projects. The government of Mexico is fixated on the notion of the oil infrastructure. So it is very telling that during the time of this massive mortality accumulating in January and February, the Mexican government was sitting in the negotiations of buying an oil refinery in Texas. So it could use some of the very scarce resources, as you pointed out, that Mexico had, and it decided to use them to buy an oil refinery. But other infrastructure projects that the committee has discussed in previous statements, like the construction of the airport in Mexico City and the construction of these railroads, particularly in the Yucatan state. So the government in Mexico has very clear priorities for what it wants to use its scarce resources on, and it's what it did. And it cost the government in the election. So the federal elections, so the government, the party the ruling party lost the majority, the two-thirds majority that it had in the lower house of Congress. And it saw the official party lose half of the municipalities in Mexico City, which the current president has enjoyed governing for the better part of the last 25 years. So it did reflect in some of the reaction of the electorate that the response of the government was so weak, and that as a result, the human tragedy of COVID has been particularly costly in Mexico. This also has the fiscal side that you mentioned. Mexico did not have a lot of fiscal space. So faced with that scarcity and with the desire to focus on very specific fiscal projects, the government did not respond very strongly to COVID with fiscal response. It did respond reasonably well with the financial support. So in terms of what the central bank did qualitatively, it was very similar to what other countries did, and it was relatively successful. But the transfers programs, which you mentioned, 0.7% of GDP, pale in comparison with certainly what other countries in the region have done, and it's 10 times smaller than what advanced economies have done. And the last point I will make is just simply about the future. So Guillermo Calvo made a very interesting point about what we can do with fiscal policy. So it's almost like a new kind of supply side economics, because you're thinking that the smart way of taxation not only improves the ability of raising revenues by the accumulation of capital, but because it can affect creativity and innovation. You can create products that you don't even know that you could have. So you can think about the cell phones and the taxation of cell phone communications. So you can create new forms of taxation of generating revenue by incentivizing creativity and innovation. And by conversely, the cost of taxing has this very intangible measure of the innovation and the creativity that is suppressed. So you are doing much more damage than just affecting the accumulation of existing capital. So I think in countries like Mexico, we have to think very wisely at this, because as Andres was noting, we are a country that should be able to raise a lot more taxation, a lot more in tax revenue than we do as a share of the economy. Institutionally, it's very difficult to do, but also the construction of a smart tax system is very important. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Let me move to Chile now, which, contrary to what we've been discussing in a number of other countries, Chile has, at least before the eruption of the pandemic, a very strong fiscal position. Pepo, given the large expenditure during the pandemic by the authorities in Chile, is this threatening fiscal sustainability?
Thanks for the question, and hi to all. It's a pleasure to be in this group and to have a very, very great discussions. And I share with Enrique, we have learned a lot. Let me just mention a couple of things about Chile, which is important, and comparing to other countries. Chile had, as we have had in the last 20 years, a very active and rapid monetary policy response to the pandemic, providing liquidity and also cutting rates. And then there was also an important fiscal measures. And however, they came a little bit late. They were strong in providing credit and credit guarantees that kind of mitigate the impact on the corporate sector. But the help to the people came a little bit slow and was a little bit shy. And this has basically two consequences. The first, that there was a big discussion about and 30% of pension funds saved for retirement were withdrawn and have been, not all of them spent, but there has been a massive spending, which also adds a lot to aggregate demand. This year, the government has been much more much more active. There is a very important fiscal expansion to help the poor. And we have the curiosity that in Chile, the fiscal impulse is stronger this year than the previous year. The previous year, the economy declined by 6%. This year is growing at about 9%, a very strong recovery on the monetary policy, fiscal policy, and also expenditure and these savings from the pension fund, which also leaves a lot of scars for the future and for pensions, which is a big problem. Now, the Chilean problem has another problem. It has a lot of social unrest pre-pandemic. And there was a need and I would say a demand for much more social spending. So the fiscal situation in Chile, and what you ask, it has two components that are quite important. Much more social demands, and after big fiscal impulse with a lot of help to the people, which should be transitory. Because we know that in Latin America and emerging markets, fiscal policy has a lot of inertia. There is a lot of fiscal inertia. You provide some transitory help, but then become permanent. So Chile has to first withdraw the transitory help and also needs to have a additional social and fiscal social expenditure, which leads that to the need that Chile is in a very stable fiscal position, but deteriorating from the 20s public debt to close to 40% of GDP this year. So we Chile don't want to go on an unsustainable trajectory. We'll have to raise taxes in the next few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pepo. Let's turn and I guess we'll have to finish also our discussions with two countries that have IMF programs. Since we've been discussing a lot about the IMF during our deliberations, we have Costa Rica and Ecuador with different issues, different problems. So Laura, how do you assess prospects of the IMF agreement with Costa Rica? In your view, do the authorities have the willingness to deal and solve the fiscal problem?
Thanks, Liliana. Hopefully next time we can all be together in the same room. Let me just go back a little bit before addressing the IMF concern. As everyone has mentioned, this has been at the heart a health crisis, and the solution of this health crisis will involve some science, vaccination, and some economic adaptation and social adaptation. And sadly, a lot of this does go through the capacity of the country. So Costa Rica is one example of a country that very quickly wanted to claim success in dealing with the pandemic, in number of cases, number of deaths, just to see later an increase in both. Sadly, in a country that was very quick to get contracts with some of the pharmaceutical, but has had a very low vaccination rate. Now we lag Brazil, just to give you an example. This is a country that one would have thought, because of the size and the health system, that would have been able to deal with this health-wise better, but the low capacity came back to haunt. And that low capacity has also meant that we still don't have a plan by the executive. One example, we still don't know how to deal with the education consequence of the pandemic. This is something we are not addressing in the statement. Again, it would just be very complex, but Latin America has been ravaged in health, in deaths, and in education. We will have a lost decade, even without macroeconomic crisis. Costa Rica is the country at the OECD that has interrupted the most the number of days they give classes. Kids have been without education for 2 months, not even internet. The government decided not to give online classes. So again, all of this goes through capacity. Costa Rica is also an example of the concerns expressed in the statement. Pablo said it. This excess liquidity support in many countries has lowered the effort to reform. And this has been the case of the executive in Costa Rica. they have been talking about the need to do something. March 2020 is almost July 2021, and the executive doesn't push for reforms. It's also an example of the lack of capacity to spend a lot of money. Costa Rica, again, the government, huge scandal of corruption, now in infrastructure. So again, this is an example that the IMF needs to remain vigilant. The resources need to be used efficiently, and they need to work in this agreement to make sure that is the case. The good news is that the parliament is being a little bit more serious than the executive, perhaps not a high bar, but they are pushing to reform, they are pushing to help the people in need, they are pushing to also revive the economy, and also to push some of these reforms that we do need, because we do need to solve some of these concerns.
Thanks a lot, Laura. Augusto, we've left you at the end because Ecuador, politically and economically, seems to be going in a different direction than much of the region. And so I wanted to leave the discussion with Ecuador to the end, to have a different view about the rest of the region. Ecuador has moved away from authoritarian populism and street violence, and seems to be enthusiastically re-embracing freedom, democratic checks and balances, and economic openness. So why such contrast with neighboring countries? You're going to give us a positive attitude towards the region by listening to your answer.
Thank you, Liliana, and I hope I won't take too much time. Let me try to be very, very succinct. You know, I've been thinking, what is different about Ecuador? And obviously, the pandemic hit Ecuador as bad as any other country. The initial conditions in Ecuador when the pandemic hit were worse than in other countries. The collapse in oil prices left Ecuador in very difficult fiscal and macroeconomic circumstances. The level of social disparities, inequalities, and sense of unfairness is comparable in Ecuador than in other countries. So what is different? And I think there are two things that are different in Ecuador and that may help explain why Ecuador is moving in a different direction compared to, say, Colombia or Bolivia or Peru. One is that Ecuador faces a very hard budget constraint in the economic side. It's a dollarized economy. And you either have dollars or you don't have dollars. You cannot print them. Ecuador, because of its history, has a very high country risk premium. So it cannot borrow easily dollars in the international markets. So Ecuador is faced with a hard budget constraint that forces people to have a conversation about what can we do that is not a simple short-run myopic expansion. And that pushed Ecuador to have a greater social conversation about solutions. That's one difference. The other difference is that Ecuador had already 10 years of authoritarian populism. And people felt the oppressive of that type of political setting. It was a regime that was full of arbitrariness, a very high concentration of power in the hands of the executive, therefore with a lot of room for abuse, that produced a spending binge during the bonanza that became unsustainable and produced the highest levels of corruption the country has ever seen. So the elections in Ecuador were very much a recognition that we need to solve problems with a hard budget constraint on the one hand, and the other hand, that we wanted, Ecuadorians seem to want, to do it in an environment of greater freedom, more open conversation, and greater amounts of institutional checks and balances. So oddly enough, democracy had lost a lot of legitimacy in Ecuador, but now it's starting to regain it. And of course, it's going to be a big test as to whether this country, with the constraints that it has, can manage this new social compact, so to speak, into a viable recovery that is compatible with fiscal sustainability and greater equity. But for the time being, there's a level of optimism and enthusiasm in Ecuador that I don't think you'll find anywhere else in the region.
Thanks a lot, Augusto. You have injected some optimism into the region. You were talking about neighboring countries, and I cannot stop thinking about my own country, Peru, where we are almost getting into a month after the election, and we still don't have a president, and political instabilities are really mounting there. I think we don't have more time. We have actually passed the time that we had allocated to this discussion, which is always unfortunate because as the audience can see, I mean, the wealth of knowledge that we have in front of us is enormous, and we never have enough time. But anyway, so I want to thank you, all of you. Apologies to those that have raised questions that I have not been able to address because of lack of time. Please, I hope that you join us in a few months for our 45th statement of CLAAF. And thanks again, and goodbye to all.